Good evening from the Oxford Union Society. The debating hall is packed with undergraduates, many of them standing or sitting on the floor for this televised debate on the common market, which began about half an hour ago in high spirits and uproarious style with the opening undergraduate speeches which have just concluded. The motion is that this House would say yes to Europe. The visiting speeches, which will start in a moment, are from Jeremy Thorpe and Edward Heath for the motion, with Barbara Castle and Peter Shaw against. The Oxford Union, founded over 150 years ago, is the most famous of all university debating societies, though in Cambridge they might call it the most notorious. Many great parliamentarians, including prime ministers, have here had their first youthful experience of political debate in public. In the 19th century, Mr. Gladstone was president of the Oxford Union. That was in 1830. Mr. Asquith in 1874. Lord Curzon in 1880. And Lord Birkenhead, that's Lord Curzon, and Lord Birkenhead, F.E. Smith, there in 1894. In this century, those who made their start in the debating hall as undergraduate orators in the parliamentary manner have included Harold Macmillan, and more recently, Lord Hailsham, Michael Foote, Anthony Crosland, Edward Boyle, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, and two of tonight's main speakers, Edward Heath and Jeremy Thorpe, both of whom achieved the coveted distinction of being elected president of the Oxford Union by their undergraduate contemporaries, Mr. Heath in 1939 and Mr. Thorpe in 1951. The current president is Mr. Victor van Amerongen of Magdalen College. He and the other three undergraduates elected at this term's officers of the Union, the librarian and the treasurer on either side of him, and the secretary below in front, wear the traditional full evening dress, which is the traditional rig for these debates. On the floor of the House are the less formally attired members of the Union who will vote on the motion in about 2.5 hours' time. How they vote is not particularly important, nor would they claim to be fully representative of student opinion in Oxford. But union speeches, union debates like this, with speeches by visiting parliamentarians, are often exciting occasions, full of good argument and entertainment, and anything could happen in tonight's debate. And we've now had the last of the undergraduate speakers, and I hand over to Ludovic Kennedy to fill us in.
And I hand over to the President.
Thank you very much for that. Now it is with great pleasure that I call upon the Right Honourable Peter Shaw MP, King's College, Cambridge, Secretary of State for Trade,
Since we are on television, will you please confirm, Mr. President, sir, that it is doubly important that honourable members remember the courtesy of this House and do not hiss or blow?
I think the reaction to that point is self-explanatory. And now, with great pleasure, I call upon Mr. Shaw to speak for and against the motion.
Mr. President, may I begin by congratulating you and the others responsible for their uncanny foresight in selecting as early as the 31st of March 1975 this motion for debate in the Oxford Union. I don't know whether you had a hotline to number 10 or whether you simply inferred or your instinct led you to conclude that at that time there would in fact be a referendum, and the decision of such great importance as it is being taken by the whole country only 2 days after this debate was staged. But anyway, it is a singular triumph for you, sir, and I think we are all aware of this here tonight, that we are engaging in not just a debate in which the members of the Oxford Union are engaged, but we are conducting a debate which the whole country, or a very large part of it, is deeply concerned in, and which very many are watching, I believe, tonight. And may I also congratulate the speakers who have just put their case not the case that I would myself accept, but nevertheless they put their case with obvious sincerity, although I think with a very significantly different emphases, as some have looked to the future in Europe from the point of view of perhaps some kind of union, of a federal union nature, for reasons which are obvious. Others, the original mover of the motion, was obviously deeply concerned that there should develop in Western Europe some new great center of power in the world, which carries with it implications, of course, for the security of the West and indeed the security of the whole world, and further implications about the integration of peoples, of governments, of the development of common institutions and the like. And I also congratulate very warmly indeed my own opposer, who has put the case already so very well. Now, sir, I'd like also to make my last bit of congratulation, which is to welcome the fact that the motion here puts without ambiguity the central question that the country will decide in 2 days' time. The central question is, of course, the question of whether we are going to say yes to entry to the common market. Well, whether we are saying yes, if Mr. Heath will only contain himself for one moment, his hour. He knows very well, and he wishes more ardently than anyone in Britain, that the gift of choice, which is now with the British people, was not theirs. Because his, of course, his... Well, I don't mind people saying shame, but you know, simply on the record, the one thing that the country did not have when faced with the great decision, whether rightly or wrongly, the decision itself of joining the common market 3 years ago, the one thing that it was denied was the right of the British people to have their say as to whether or not, whether by general election or by referendum or by any other means, the British people were left out entirely of the whole consideration. And it has taken us after a great fight and with much help from thousands and hundreds of thousands of people throughout the country to bring us at least to the point where the British people have the right to say that this is right for them or not. So do not despise the fact that your own fellow citizens have at last been given the right which Mr. Heath denied them. Now, I want to say this. One thing which is wrong, of course, with this motion is that it says Europe. And what we are talking about is not some generalized consent to Europe. What we are asked to do is to say yes to a particular group of European nations and enter into, with them, a particular form of relationship, a particular contract, a particular treaty. And it is time that in considering this whole matter, we should put to ourselves the facts that the 8 countries of Western Europe, important as they are not even half of Western Europe itself, let alone the whole of the continent of Europe. Nor, for that matter, should we ignore the fact that there exists outside the continent of Europe altogether more European people or people of European origin in the great continents of North America, Latin America, and Australasia than there exists in the whole common market put together. And beyond that, we should recall the fact that our horizon and the concerns that we have in the world as a country and as a people are not limited to 8 nations and 200 million people in Western Europe, but to the 3,000 million people and the 140 nations that exist in the 6 continents of the world. And the policies that we pursue as a government, the causes that we follow as a people, the concerns that we have are not confined to and limited to this narrow area across the Channel. For that to happen to Britain would be a contraction and a reduction of all the things with which we have been concerned. It is the world that we belong to, and it is mankind of which we are part. So let us hear. Let us hear no more. Let us hear no more. Let us hear no more of the overwhelming importance in the world perspective of these 8 countries that exist on the other side of the Channel. Now, sir, of course, I think what we have to also remember is this. We have to remember what is involved in this particular treaty that Mr. Heath signed, not on my behalf, but he signed without the authority of the British people. What was taken on? Well, yes. Every convention, every precedent that we've had as a country, every time that anyone in the history of Britain has proposed to change what are basically the rules of the political operation of our country, whether it was to reduce the powers of the House of Lords, whether it was to extend the electorate from what it was in the past, a very restricted one, to a much broader one, whenever that's happened, whenever a major change has taken place in the way in which our democracy operates, in the rights of our people, in how the Constitution itself of our country operates, whenever that's happened, and whenever there has been a major disagreement between the government of the day and Her Majesty's opposition, whenever that's happened, every government in British history, except for Mr. Heath, has felt the duty, the obligation to go to the people to get their consent for that change. He didn't do it. He didn't do it. And what is involved in the Common Market Treaty, in the Rome Treaty, is something which at last the country has understood goes far beyond any matter of economics, however important they may be, and I'll have something to say about that in a moment. But what it goes beyond is a simple but basic, of course, change in that Britain now has, for the first time, yes, a written constitution. A written constitution which no one in Britain has had any hand in shaping. And you know what that constitution is. The superior constitution which now guides and binds British governments is the Treaty of Rome. There exists a law, a power to make laws, a power to levy taxes, a power to develop policies, which is superior to those powers of taxation and of lawmaking in the British Parliament itself. That's the change. Don't tell me that that isn't something that doesn't matter to you. Well, if it doesn't matter to you, then something terrible has happened to the British people, because it is the power, precisely those powers, of deciding your own laws, which is the very heart of your own democracy. And if you don't think that doesn't matter, then by God, you are indeed a strange generation that has come to Oxford. Now I turn from the gravity, I would say the enormity, of what was involved in that transfer, as he would have it, irrevocable transfer of democratic power to others outside this country. I turn from that to the actual nature, the actual consequences, as it were, of the treaty itself. I said it was not just a treaty about trade. If it was about cooperation, it was about many forms of cooperation. You wouldn't just have me opposing as I have opposed. Of course not. I believe in extending the area of trade and cooperation with Western Europe. I believe in it as strongly as anyone else. But there are within this treaty enormous provisions which have consequences for Britain, which are of the most serious kind. You'd be very foolish indeed if you sought to ignore them. Because what the Treaty of Rome, of course, insists is not just that we trade freely with each other, but that first, we have no frontier as far as the movement of money is concerned. And every British government since 1939 has felt it necessary to control the movement of money out of Britain, and for very obvious reasons. Not only is money free to move, but firms are free to move. That is part of the rights of the Treaty of Rome that it gives to business firms. And therefore, if governments in Britain are seeking, for reasons which you surely would understand, that is to say, to protect the employment and the livelihood of our own people, and if therefore they wish to exercise those controls to prevent money and firms moving out of Britain, the rights of the British Parliament will be overridden by the actual rules, regulations and superior law of the treaty itself. Does it matter? Yes, I think it does. And on top of that, of course, you have got an agricultural food policy system. I do not believe that it is right for any elected government to hand to others such serious matters that affect the welfare of our whole nation. But it has, you may say, who indeed is responsible for Britain's food and agriculture today? And how much longer will it even be worth calling on the Ministry of Agriculture? You may say, oh, well, what a splendid fellow Monsieur Lardinois is. What a splendid fellow. No doubt, but I tell you this, he's not elected and he's not responsible to anyone in this land. He is the man who is deciding more than any other person the policies that affect the food and the agriculture of the whole of Western Europe. I do not think that that's a very happy arrangement. And of course, the policy that he's carrying out is the policy that is written into the treaty itself. That is to say, a policy which seeks to protect the entirely different structure of farming that has developed in Germany and France and elsewhere. Entirely different. And you know how different it is. If you've got 15% of your population working on small farms, as they have in France, or you have 8 or 9% in Germany, or 20% in Italy, compared with 3% in Britain, what kind of cost structure and food price structure do you expect to get? Well, of course, a protected agriculture on the continent of Europe is an entirely different thing from the kind of open policies that we've pursued ever since we made the great national decision to repeal our own corn laws, to get rid of taxes on imported food, and to develop, in partnership with our own people who went out to New Zealand and Australia and Canada and elsewhere, an ongoing and continuing relationship in the supply of food. Well, those who seek to frighten us now by saying, on the basis of the one special crisis year of 73-4, that somehow the world food situation has been totally transformed, and what was previously always recognized as one of the great handicaps and drawbacks of the common market, the agricultural policy and food prices, suddenly become an asset. They're talking through their hats. And indeed, even now, there is only one commodity, one foodstuff that we buy from Western Europe, which is actually cheaper in the common market than it is in the world outside. And that won't last very long either. I'm referring to sugar. Wheat, maize, beef, butter, lamb, all the rest of it are today taxed and heavily taxed at the frontiers of the common market. And if the common market countries believe what so many gullible people in this country have been asked to believe in this last few weeks, that is to say that there was no more food in the rest of the world and the prices were permanently higher outside than in. Well, it's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? That the common market is clutching to its protective devices and won't even discuss them in the multilateral trade negotiations which are now taking place. So anxious to preserve the levies on imported food, the export subsidies to help get rid of their surpluses, the system of intervention that leads to the mountains of this and that, so anxious that they're not even prepared to discuss with the other countries of the world in what ways, in the general context of international trade, these things might be changed. Well, so there's that. And of course, the treaty went further. What was also involved in the signing of the Rome Treaty was the acceptance of arrangements for financing the whole common market affair. I won't go into details with that. It would take too long. But there is no one who knows and has studied these things who does not agree that the contribution that Britain is going to have to make, and I'm not thinking just of our gross contribution, but our net contribution, is wholly disproportionate to our actual, as it were, income within that of the total community, and is wholly damaging to this country. Indeed, our own estimates are that by the end of the 5-year transition period, that is to say 78, 980, something of the order of £300 to £400 million a year will flow net out of Britain for that reason alone. That is to say, our net contribution to the community's budget. I do not think that's in the interest of Britain. Nor do I think the interest of Britain, the money and firms should be free to move there either. And if anyone doubts the gravity of that, I'll give them one illustration. In the 3-year period, 71, 2 and 3, Mr. Barber, you may remember him, allowed relatively free movement of money out of Britain to Europe. £1,000 million of British capital went into direct investment in plants, machinery, jobs on the European continent. And there came back £170 million at the same time. And when you think that in terms of numbers and prosperity there are 55 million of us and 200 million of them, is it not an extraordinary disproportion that that should be so? And can you not see the danger, the gravity of what that means for the future prosperity of this country, this generation, and those to come? And I say to you, this is not a treaty which in any way is a fair and equal treaty. It's not negotiated, it was accepted. Not one word, not a comma, let alone a clause, let alone a paragraph of their own treaty. Not one comma has been altered in order to meet the perfectly legitimate and serious differences that exist between Britain and the common market. And now the experience itself. 3.5 years ago, when they were urging us to go in, oh, what a campaign it was. You've got to get in to get on, was the slogan of that day. £5 or £6 a week better off for Britain if we can only get into the common market. All the goodies were spread out, and Donald Stokes of Leyland buying one-page advertisements saying, all we need is a great domestic market of 250 million, and we will sweep Europe. And you know what has happened, and this is the one significance of the trade figure. I'm not arguing who cares about the actual details of the size. That doesn't matter. It's the trend. The trend. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we were almost in balance with the common market countries. What's happened since? 500 million down in 72, 1,000 million in 73, 2,000 million in 74, running now at the rate of 2,400 million this year. Don't you see what that's going to do to the prosperity of this country? You can't go on borrowing that. And then you add to that the burdens I mentioned a moment ago, and we are under great threat. We're in peril at the present time, and the country must know it. And therefore, now what do they say? What is the message that comes now? No longer to tell the British people about the goodies that lie there. No longer that. That won't wash, will it? Because the evidence will no longer support it. And so the message that comes out is fear, fear, fear. Fear because you won't have any food. Fear of unemployment. Fear that we've somehow been so reduced as a country that we can no longer, as it were, totter about in the world independent as a nation. And a constant attrition of our morale, a constant attempt to tell us that what we have, and what we have is not only our own achievement, but what generations of Englishmen have helped us to achieve, is not worth a damn. The kind of laughter that greeted the early references that I made, that what was involved was the transfer of the whole of our democratic system to others. Not a damn. Well, I tell you, what we now have to face in Britain, what the whole argument is about, now that the fraud and the promise has been exposed, what it's about is basically the morale and the self-confidence of our people. We can shape our future. We are 55 million people. If you look around the world today, I listen to Gough Whitlam and his 14 million Australians, and he trades heavily with Japan. I'm very fond of the Australians. But do you think he's going to enter into a relationship with Japan where he gives Japan the right to make the laws in Australia? Do you think Canada, 22 million of them, and to the south a great and friendly nation? Yes, they are. But do you think Canada is going to allow its laws to be written by the 200 million people in some union in America? No, of course not. The whole thing is an absurdity, and therefore I urge you to reject it. I urge you to say no to this motion, and I urge the whole British country to say no on Thursday in the referendum.
Mr. Shaw very much for that speech, and it is now with great pleasure that I call upon the Right Honourable Jeremy Thorpe MP, Trinity ex-President, Leader of the Liberal Party, to speak fifth and in favour of the motion.
Mr. President, sir, may I first thank you for your invitation and say that for one who was nurtured in this society, I can think of nowhere better to debate this great issue. And may I say, first of all, that the right honourable gentleman who has just spoken has totally and utterly convinced me on one issue, and that is the total dissatisfaction, if not disgust, which he holds for the terms which his colleagues in the Cabinet brought back from Brussels. And in his disgust at the efforts of the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the poor old Minister of Agriculture, who apparently is a mere cipher of Monsieur Ladinois, I want to ask him and the Right Honourable Lady, how was it that they were let down? Did they know what the agenda was when they went out to renegotiate? Or were they kept in the dark for a year, not knowing what was going on? Because if so, any self-respecting minister would have resigned. But if they knew, but since they are obviously both right honourable members of integrity, they must have known what was on the agenda. At what moment did the frightful moment of truth hit them that everything that they'd wanted hadn't been brought back? Was it within hours of the Dublin summit? There are, of course, cynics who say that they would have turned down the terms whatever they were. But I cannot believe that that can be the case. And therefore, a question to which I believe this country is entitled to an answer is, if the answer on June the 5th is yes, they will, of course, accept the wishes of the British people. But what else will they do? Will they continue as ministers, implementing policies which they believe to be disastrous from the United Kingdom? Will they do that? Or will they go on, half-heartedly, on full pay, so to speak, the 5 maggots in the European apple? Or will they overnight have a total conversion to the European cause? I think we are entitled to know. And if the right honourable gentleman is not prepared to say, I hope that the right honourable lady will do so. And may I say that if she does not, some of us who practiced at the criminal bar remember those prisoners who are asked to plead and refuse, and the judge has to decide whether they are mute of malice or by visitation of God. You see, we are here, the Right Honourable Gentleman and myself, we are here to support the Prime Minister. At least on this issue. In fairness, it is true to say that we have all at different times on this issue supported the Prime Minister. They on phase 1 and phase 3 when he was against, the Right Honourable Gentleman and myself on phase 2 and phase 4 when he was in favour. He's outmanoeuvred St. Paul. He was converted but once on the road to Damascus. The Prime Minister has been converted twice on the road to Europe. Well, first of all, of course, we are told that the Right Honourable Gentleman alone is a great constitutionalist because he and his colleagues put it to the British people. In 1967, the Labour government applied to join. There was never going to be a general election or a referendum. In the words of the Prime Minister, it was going to be left to Parliament to decide. There was nothing in the 1970 Labour manifesto which said that there must be a referendum or an election. Again, it was to be left to Parliament, and that was the view of the Prime Minister right up till 1972. The only reason that the Labour Party today is not prepared to leave it to the sovereignty of Parliament, about which they talk so much, is because, as Shirley Williams said, if there hadn't been a referendum, the Labour Party would have broken apart. And it'll do so even though there is a referendum. But we happen to believe that it is, to quote the Prime Minister, it is right for Britain, it is right for Europe, it is right for the Commonwealth, it is right for the world to stay in, because it's the fastest growing market in the world. It is an outward-looking market. But what is their alternative? Apart from an intonation which sounded something like Michael Foot's, and the word Britain pronounced in a rather Churchillian sense, there was no alternative put forward from the Right Honourable Gentleman whatsoever. Which countries in the world want us closer to them in a new trading relationship? Which ones? Presumably they want trade. They want as much trade as they can get. They also, the next breath, say, well, we must also be allowed to have protection and put up tariffs. Free trade means actually that you trade freely. Is it the Commonwealth? The only Commonwealth leader who wants us out is General Amin. Over the Right Honourable Gentleman talking about Canada and Australia and New Zealand. They are in negotiation with the common market. Pierre Trudeau came over because he wanted a contractual relationship with them. There is no member of the Commonwealth who says, please come out, because we would so much rather trade with you out of Europe than continue our own association with the community. And what about the new Commonwealth? The 22 Commonwealth countries who benefited from Mrs. Hart in one of her temporary pro-European movements. Do they want to come out of a common market in which there is totally free entry for their industrial products, virtually free entry for their agricultural products, and a development fund of 1,600 million on which they can draw? So that is not an alternative, and I note that the Right Honourable Gentleman didn't put it forward. Delighted.
We do not accept that after you abandoned them, the Commonwealth had nowhere else to go but to the common market. And that...
First and foremost, I do not accept that the Commonwealth was abandoned. Secondly, I would remind the Honourable Gentleman from Sri Lanka that there were members of the Commonwealth who actually had associate membership, like Nigeria, of the common market before we even joined. And we are dealing with realities. And the reality is that the whole of the Commonwealth wants Britain to stay in. And the Commonwealth itself is deriving clear benefits. So there's no alternative there. And unless the right honourable gentleman or the right honourable lady can put forward an alternative, they're asking you to leap into the unknown. What about the EFTA countries? Certainly not Norway, or Denmark, or Sweden, or Austria, or Portugal, or Switzerland, or Finland, or Iceland. Why? Because they already have an industrial free trade relationship with the community. Now, I'll come to the point in a minute. Couldn't we do the same? If we pull out, those countries will immediately have to erect a tariff against us. Unless, of course, we ask them to tear up their treaties, to renegotiate their position with the common market, and ask the common market then to renegotiate a position with us. But what evidence is it that any one of those countries wants us to come out? Which one has told the right honourable gentleman or the right honourable lady, please come out? We as an EFTA country depend upon your leaving the common market. None whatsoever. Ah, says Mr. Benn, but of course they'll have to give us a new arrangement. We're so important to them. Are we? We export 33.4% of our exports to the 8. We export 50% of our exports to Western Europe. Not just the 8, but the 8 plus EFTA. The common market export 8% of their exports to us. Are we really so important to them that they will fall over backwards? I think not. And if the right honourable gentleman is doing his job as Secretary of State for Trade, the first thing he'd do is to see that this country remained in a trading bloc, which now involves 84 countries of the world. Not 8, but 84. Ah, you say, but what about the Norwegian experience? Well, is he satisfied? Is the right honourable lady, with her great passion for sovereignty, satisfied with a situation in which Norway only gets an industrial free trading relationship, providing she accepts the regulations relating to state aid, to nationalised industries, to monopolies, which apply to the whole of the community, in which they have already had to cut back half of their proposed trawler-free zones in order to get free trade for their fishing products, in which they are only given a one-year agreement, which can be abrogated, and in which the common market reserved to themselves the right to erect an external tariff for anything which they deem to be sensitive, that is to say, of competitive value. That would affect straight away, I suggest, chemicals, the textile industry, and the motor car industry. Do they want to pay the price for food, which Norway is having to pay? 50% more on beef, 80% more on bread, wheat 40% more, sugar having to be bought on the world market. Is that the alternative they want? I do not believe that either the Commonwealth or the EFTA countries are an alternative. Have they been in touch with Eastern Europe? That's another trading bloc. Let's look at everything. Is that their proposal? And where, may I ask, is the right honourable lady with her now proverbial shopping basket? Where will she be going like Little Red Riding Hood round the world? To find cheap food. Which natives has she in mind to exploit? The fact remains, Mr. President, that the shortage of food in the world is something to which the right honourable gentleman hasn't yet woken up, because the primary producers are no longer going on to be being exploited. And I believe it is right that we should pay a fair price, but by being in this community, it is more likely that as a major collective buyer, we will have security of supplies at a fair price. And indeed, we have saved something of the order of £139 million already as a result of being in the community and paying the community prices rather than outside. The right honourable gentleman, of course, got on to capital movements. I knew there were about 15 things he could raise, and he raised about 5 of them. And he said, those who know the answer and those who study it. Well, I'll tell him about that one. His own Under-Secretary of State for Trade, in a written answer in Hansard on the 20th of May, said that of the 519 million direct investment by the United Kingdom in the common market, 144 million was financed from unremitted profits, subsidiaries and associates, 94 million by other non-cash transactions, net overseas borrowings, about 300, giving a net inflow of capital of 22 million into this country. Not an outflow, an inflow. That's from Eric Deakins, who is an anti-marketeer, who is his own Minister of State. Collective ministerial responsibility even cuts ministries in half. And so we have had any reference to the Liberal Party. I will tell you, my friend, there is one party in this country that has always been totally consistent on Europe, and it has been the Liberal Party. And I will tell our friend that if it hadn't been for the votes of the Conservative and Liberal parties, the policies of the two right honourable lady and gentlemen which they now oppose would not have had a majority in the House of Commons. And I will also tell him if it hadn't been for the vote of the Liberal Party, the legislation of the right honourable gentleman would not have been passed in 1972. And therefore, let us not hear anything about the Liberal Party and its failure to support. The first vote I cast in Europe was in 1960. And we had one Labour member, to his credit, in the lobby, the entire Tory party against us, and the Labour Party abstaining like sullen eunuchs. Now, what else? The bureaucrats. Oh yes, I knew we'd have that, the bureaucrats. And the terrible regulations that have been passed. Which particular regulation had they in mind? Which almost brought them to the point of resignation in the last year. Not quite, because no one has a greater devotion to staying in the job and carrying out the duty to the nation than the anti-marketeers in a pro-market cabinet. You must say they're stickers. But you know, what I found most shocking is not merely that there was no alternative. Neither EFTA, nor a free trade area, nor the Commonwealth, there was no alternative put forward. And we are being asked, after all, to come out of something which many of us believe has been to the benefit of this country. We were not merely given wrong figures on capital movements. That's if the right honourable gentleman agrees with his minister. I think his powers of sacking at the moment are not very great. We were not only given some bogus figures on food, but it doesn't seem to have crossed the mind of the right honourable gentleman that the two world wars of this century were caused by civil war in Western Europe. And for the first time, war between, for example, France and Germany is not only politically unthinkable, it is economically impossible because of the European coal and steel community and the way in which the two economies of those countries have been interwoven. Does it mean nothing to them that the democracies of Western Europe have come together for peaceful purposes? That out of the ruins of the Second World War, their cities have been rebuilt, their economies have been revived, they have extended a hand of friendship to the developing world through Lome and the other agreements, which now encompass 84 nations of the world? Does that mean nothing to them? That it is the lowest external tariff of any major marketing bloc in the world? Does that mean nothing? That it is beginning to have an influence which is recognized throughout the world, of which we are part? Does that mean nothing? Let me remind them of this. 1947, these words were said: "Working together, we are still strong enough to hold the balance of world power. But if we permit ourselves to be separated from France and so from the rest of Europe, we shall not only destroy our own and Europe's chances of recovery, but also make a third world war inevitable. A united Europe, strong enough to deter an aggressor, but voluntarily renouncing the most deadly of offensive weapons of modern warfare, would be the best guarantor of world peace. The greatest obstacle to European unity is, of course, British initiative. To be effective, this initiative must be primarily concerned with European unity. The authors of that, 1947, were the Keep Left movement of the Tribune Group. And the authors were the late Dick Crossman, Michael Foot, and Ian Mikado. Would that they believed now what they believed then, and we would live in a much more secure world. Well, if they do, I take the honourable gentleman's word for it, but I haven't actually heard those remarks during the referendum campaign. No, sir. The case of the anti-marketeers is one of narrow nationalism. How else could they have united the IRA and the provisionals? Yes, certainly. The honourable gentleman didn't know that, he better. The two extreme wings, the two terrorist wings in Ireland have for the first time become united on a political issue, that they are against Europe, against the common market. There's not a smear, it is a fact. So have both the nationalist parties. There are some good moderates, like the Right Honourable Lady and the Right Honourable Gentleman, of course. But it does say it takes quite a mixed bag to get the Communist Party and the National Front. The IRA and the Provos, we keep him out of this country. And he does not have a vote, and neither does he campaign. I would merely say that I believe that we are seeing a most extraordinary coalition of 19th century imperialists and 20th century Marxists. And I do not think it very impressive. And neither do I believe that whether you look at the contribution, or that was another point of the Right Honourable Gentleman's, he better hear what his own government again say. You take Mr. Joel Barnett's view, May the 5th, our contribution over 2 years has been 0.2% of our total public expenditure. 0.2, that's the crippling burden. May the 5th, he told us that in fact our receipts were 35 million more than our contributions. And he told us on the 16th of May that in the first 4 months of this year we had received in grants and loans £49 million more than we had put in. Now, it may well be that it will be thought wicked that we accept £15.5 million in order to modernise the tin plate works in Ebbw Vale and prevent many of Michael Foot's constituents thereby being caused redundant. That it may be wicked for the NCB to have borrowed £122 million from the European Investment Bank to carry out modernisation at much lower rates of interest than obtainable in this country. That it may be crazy to have £20 million a year for retraining. I happen to believe that because we are in the community, these are benefits which we shall enjoy, because the community exists to cooperate amongst the 250 million, and those who are most in need get the most help. And it so happens, whether we like it or not, the moment we are the sick man of Europe. And this is the moment we are asked to pull out. Mr. President, may I say this? Edmund Burke, appropriately writing to the sheriffs of Bristol, said in 1777, magnanimity in politics is not seldom the truest wisdom, and a great empire and little minds go ill together. There has been very little magnanimity on the part of the anti-marketeers as to what Europe has achieved, not only for itself but for the world. And I happen to believe that short-sightedness in politics produces the worst counsel for a nation. And today I believe that on the great issue of Europe, which demands the widest possible vision, it is the little minds who are advising us to come out. It is for that reason that I want to see them vanquished on Thursday the 5th, because I believe that Britain can have a new and confident role in Western Europe. I believe that the community itself can lead to be a great influence for peace in the world. It is so recognized by almost every nation in the world. I do not see why we should reject this great opportunity. I am delighted and proud that we are part of that community, and I hope that my fellow countrymen on Thursday will vote to see that we continue in that role and we play our full part in the unification of Western civilization.
Secretary of State for Health and Social Security to speak sixth and against the motion.
Mr. President, I'm not able, like the right honourable gentleman who has just spoken, to say I come here as a former president of the Union. Because when I was at this ancient university, women were not allowed to be members of the Union. Let alone speak. And I understand, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for making my next point for me, because I understand that since then Oxford has been dragged reluctantly and partially into the modern age, though there is, I am told by my spies, a strong undercurrent of masculine chauvinism only too anxious to put the clock back. And I understand, and I gather that it is confidently anticipated by the pro-marketeers that they are going to chalk up a victory for this motion tonight. Well, it would hardly be surprising that the establishment should score in this black tie debate. In the University Union, the cadet club of the establishment. And of course, this happy event will have been encouraged by the carefully contrived wording of the motion tonight. This House... I didn't get that. This House would say yes to Europe. Yes to Europe with all the overtones or undertones of the warm embrace of the dear ladies of Saint-Tropez. Professor Joe, thou shouldst be living at this hour. The right honourable gentleman on previous occasions has accused the anti-marketeers of demagogy. But it is the hallmark of the demagogue to refuse to define one's terms. And in this motion, there is a retreat to the gooey generalizations that are worthy of Jeremy. And I want to say to him tonight, yes, what do you mean by yes? Yes? Yes on any terms, because do not forget. Thank you. Thank you. Yes on any terms, because I've been extremely interested to hear the right honourable gentleman tonight quoting in aid of the Europe to which it is true he has been a consistent, if slightly vague, devotee over the years, quoting in aid of the Europe, the entry into Europe he has supported uncritically, changes that were secured long after he gave his vote in the House of Commons that we should go in. No critical judgment by the right honourable gentleman of the terms that were brought back by the then Prime Minister, terms which gave no guarantees about a Lomé Convention, no guarantees at all about the safeguards for developing countries, no guaranteed market for the sugar, we're now told, is the hallmark of this outward-looking community. No safeguards about our budgetary control, and not an iota of mitigation of the obscenities of the common agricultural policy. No check on the intervention buying for beef. No check on the intervention buying for beef that led to the beef mountains that are an outrage in a hungry world. And therefore, I want to say to this House, let us look precisely, please, at what saying yes to Europe involves. It involves our reaffirming our membership to an exclusive association with 6 other European nations out of 22, under the terms of a treaty which compels us to give them priority in everything. Priority in access to our markets, priority in trading relationships, priority in policy making, priority in civic rights, right of entry, right of movement, the right to work, priority over the people of any other country in the world, including the Commonwealth. And that tonight is paraded as internationalism. For the hallmark of this association is exclusiveness. This isn't just a common market, it's a customs union. Its hallmark isn't free trade among its members, but a common external tariff against the rest of the world. And if the right honourable gentleman likes to get up and say, as he's written in recent Times articles, oh, but the European community is going to negotiate away the common external tariff anyway in GATT and the other international negotiations, because if that happens, the exercise of joining has lost all its point. The home market of 250 million people, to which we're asked to sacrifice our freedom of action.
Mr. Castle, if you would take a point of information, I would hope that Mr. Thorpe would perhaps bring this up. But as you yourself are no doubt aware, the common external tariff, when it is finally adopted by this country, will in fact be 2.5% lower than the tariff we at the moment have.
It will be lower on some items. Just a minute. Let me finish. It will be lower on some items, but it will be imposed for the first time on a whole range of goods that come into Britain duty-free. And that is to be imposed in the name of the liberalisation of trade, because it is the abandonment. Yes, I can give you a large number of examples, and I am coming to them, because the imposition of tariffs on goods which used to come in free from our Commonwealth is one of the sacrifices we have had to make in the name of internationalism. And therefore, I say that the common external tariff is the criterion. And if it goes, then what's the argument about? Why do we have to go into this complicated, new, and in many ways disadvantageous relationship? Why do we have to have a common agricultural policy and a budgetary contribution, which causes so many difficulties when the home market of 250 million people in Europe has become a home market of 3,800 million people in the world as a whole? And it's this exclusiveness of this community is underpinned by a policy of agricultural protectionism designed to make Europe self-sufficient in high-cost food, regardless of the effects on other countries' economies. And really, Mr. President, nothing is more nauseating than the pro-marketeers' pretense that they're engaged on a great philanthropic exercise. They're there to extend a helping hand to developing countries, and actually to agree, we are told, the opening here and there of their market stores. What concern do they show for other countries' economies when they make this country, for the first time, slap an import levy of 12% on tinned pineapple from Malaysia? Yes. Oh, Malaysia's only a developing country worthy of a sneer from you great internationalists. But Malaysia was, in fact, the largest single supplier of tinned pineapple. And normally came into this country free. And Malaysia's economy has got to take the fact that as part of our membership, we have had to put a tariff on that important produce to their economy. And I wish Oxford wouldn't reveal its lack of knowledge of these countries quite so revealingly by the laughter that it makes. Well, as long as it's not coming out of my time.
I'm kind of information. I merely wish to ask if you have the authority of the Malaysian government for your view that Britain's continued membership of the community is more harmful, or if the reports which I understood came out of the Kingston Conference were more accurate and those Commonwealth governments do wish us to remain in the community.
If you think any Commonwealth country wanted the imposition of these tariff barriers, then you must be mad, because no country is going to rejoice in the interference with what has been a normal flow of trade. And once again, what concern do the common community show for other countries' economies when they virtually ban imports of beef from Latin America and Australia, when they make us tax the New Zealand lamb they don't even produce themselves, and they tax our bread when the world price of wheat falls, as it is now falling and estimated to fall, on every side. And when that particular argument fails, they say, well, they've done it. They've done all this, not in the developing countries' interests, but in our interests. And the right honourable gentleman who has just spoken has said time and again in his arguments that membership has given this country a stable and secure source of food at reasonable prices, and has the nerve to quote sugar, the classic example, as you will all have seen if you read my brilliant letter today in The Guardian. A classic example of where this country had a secure and stable source of supply through the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement, which had to be wound up, and its demise was announced by the right honourable gentleman, then Prime Minister, as part of the terms of our accession to the European community. And so we've been in the world market scramble for sugar, which has led both to higher prices in this country and now a catastrophic fall in the world price again, and increasing insecurity for developing countries. Of course, as a socialist, I believe the primary producers ought to have a better reward for their commodities. But what is intolerable about this so-called exercise in internationalism is that when the price of butter, cheese, meat, flour and bread goes up in our shops, the bulk of that increase isn't going to the overseas countries that produce the food and from whom we imported it. It is going as taxes into the budget of the community to help sustain a high-cost European agriculture. And that is the whole purpose of the exercise. For there's one thing you must never forget about our membership. It means that all the trading on behalf of all the members is conducted by the bloc, first and foremost in the bloc's own interests. And the stronger the bloc, the more it can pick and choose its associates. And this, again, is demonstrated by what happened at Lomé, which the right honourable gentleman had the nerve to quote as though he invented it. The Lomé Convention which embodies new arrangements between the community and its associates and extends associate membership to 22 developing Commonwealth countries. Now, this convention is widely recognised as having been a personal triumph for our own Minister of Overseas Development, Mrs. Judith Hart, and yet she's vocal among the dissenting ministers. Why? Because she knows both to her and to the developing countries it is her ministerial job to keep in touch with and to understand the whole concept of association, permitted licensed association with a powerful European bloc, is a paternalistic and a neo-colonial one. She is a dissenting minister because the largest and poorest countries in the world, India, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, are left out of this circle of privilege because their membership would not suit the trading interests of the European bloc. She is a dissenting minister because she knows these countries, India, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, the major recipients from the British aid programme, still do not draw any financial aid from the European Development Fund, which is directed exclusively towards the associates. Oh, yes, by great struggles, we forced the other members of the community to concede the principle of someday, somehow, somewhen, giving financial aid to India and these other poorer Asian communities. But they still refuse to implement it. This, then, is the new internationalism, a selective relationship with the rest of the world, controlled and dictated by a powerful European bloc. And what kind of internationalism is it that says that henceforth this country must give priority to a Frenchman over an Indian, a German over an Australian, an Italian over a Malaysian? This isn't the language of internationalism. This isn't the language that we've been hearing in this debate tonight. It is Euro-jingoism. There's been... Listen to that great pro-marketeer Woodrow Wyatt in the Sunday Mirror last weekend. I quote, "The common market contains the 225 million most intelligent, cultured and developed peoples in the world. United, no one can push us around." Or take Mr. Ronald Butt, the pro-marketeer Bishop of the Times. I quote, "Do I feel more European than anything else? Certainly, in my own case, I do feel more of a European than anything else. Except English. The Commonwealth, I believe," said Mr. Butt, "was one of the more lamentable things that happened in the post-war world." These are your great pro-marketeers, your great internationalists. This is It is this mentality that has motivated the British establishment from the Foreign Office upwards in the past few years in its determination to manoeuvre us into the community, to persuade us to turn our backs on the tiresome multiracialism of the Commonwealth, on the clamour for independence and nationhood among once submissive colonial people, and join a decent European club where chaps like ourselves could really assert ourselves. And they wanted two things: increased consumption and increased power. They lured us into the market with the mirage of the market miracle.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady. Holding these views as passionately and sincerely as she does, may we assume that if the vote is yes, she would not stay on to administer those policies as a minister?
If the vote goes yes, my country will need me to save it even more. And so this is...
Sorry, can I call for order from that member?
And so this is what you will mean if you say yes to Europe tonight. The voting for a European bloc and its licensed associates. The voting for a bloc which is moving, pressurised by these two right honourable gentlemen into economic and monetary union. Neither of them would deny it, so please don't once again show your ignorance. A bloc which will then... A bloc which will then, as the honourable mover of the motion said with great honesty, develop into a complete federal state with its own defence policy, its own currency, its own armed forces, its own nuclear weapons, claiming to be an independent nuclear power, another superstate in the world which is plagued by superstates. Are we to throw into the explosive situation of the world today yet another nuclear power in the heart of Europe? I say to you, if you do that, you will cause a desert, and the right honourable gentleman will call it peace.
Applause for Mrs. Barbara Castle from this apparently overwhelmingly pro-common market Oxford Union audience, but she stood it out valiantly, as you saw, and the next speaker will be Mr. Heath, who will be called by the President.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now, with great pleasure, I call upon the Right Honourable Edward Heath MP, Balliol ex-President and former Prime Minister, to speak seventh and in favour of the motion.
Mr. President, sir, as the country moves towards the day on which it is going to take its decision next Thursday in the referendum, it's looking here tonight to this hall, which has seen so many historic debates in the past, to Oxford, centre of learning, ancient city, one time centre of government. And the nation has heard passionate speeches on both sides of this case, and much detail about the aspects of the community life. And of course, there is a danger that in these matters there may be confusion in people's minds about the balance of the argument. But I would like to congratulate you, sir, on the arrangement for this debate, on the fact that apparently by creating yourself a charitable institution at a stroke, you have gathered this tremendous assembly here tonight. But I want to talk about the great issues on which I think the decision should be taken on Thursday. In the 150 years of the life of this society, we have seen in Europe the growth of the nation-state and the development to its ultimate position. And if we look at the first 50 years of this century, I don't think many of us here, whether we debated in the 30s or whether we debate today, can look back with very much satisfaction to the achievements of the nation-state in those first 50 years, to the two great wars of 1914 and 1939. As the leader of the Liberal Party has said, European civil wars, not wars of religion, not wars of race, as we have seen recently, but countries with the same background and the same tradition of European civilization, Christian civilization, tearing themselves apart. And in between those two wars, as we debated so often in my time here, genocide of 6 million innocent Jews in Europe. And after the Second Great War, the creation of the nuclear weapon, which can obliterate our own continent. Well, that's 50 years of the ultimate completion of the power of the nation state. But what we've seen in the last 25 years, since 1950, has been the creation of a new organization, the community, the European community. And I'm somewhat sad that it's still apparent that those who have spoken so passionately against this motion tonight have not realized the nature of this new community and its institutions, and first and foremost, that its purpose is a political one. And when I have sometimes heard doubts expressed, perhaps, about the relationship of the European community to peace and security, then can I remind honourable members that the main purpose of the creation of this community was to prevent France and Germany ever fighting each other again, and to remove the means of creating war from their hands. Now, all of this may have come to be accepted as the nature of the community. To my generation, which stood at this box and was haunted by the fact that we knew the Second World War was coming, not a question of whether, but a question of when, then that is a triumph beyond our wildest dreams in those last years of the 30s. It was at this box that I stood and denounced the Munich Agreement, because I believed it was appeasement of the worst order, and it was bound to lead to the conflict between the tyrannies, the expanding tyrannies of Europe, in Italy, in Germany, which had overwhelmed Austria, to which Czechoslovakia had been handed on a plate. And when I debated here in 1941 or 1940, it was with Benesch at the box, both on the same side, the man who had been betrayed. And so we knew that that conflict was coming. And it is really to us one of the miracle achievements of this post-war period that the community should have been established and should have bound together those two ancient enemies of the wars of Napoleon, of the wars of 70, of 14, and of 39. And to me, this can never, never be taken for granted. And I believe, of course, that we in Britain, and I've believed this ever since 1945, we in Britain have a major part to play in the creation of this community and its new institutions. And when the Secretary of State for Trade says that there are aspects of the Treaty of Rome which he disputes and dislikes and believe were not shaped to suit our purpose, then I say to him, and whose responsibility was that? It was the responsibility of the government of his own party of 1950-51, which rejected the opportunity of going into the formation of that coal and steel community, which could have shaped not only that community, but the others which followed it and which today form the United Communities, Coal and Steel. Now, of course, again, how often at this box in the 30s did we debate the massive unemployment up and down the country, its impact on individuals, quite apart from any question as to whether we had a future when we left this society. But the impact of this unemployment, it was on that the dictators rose to power. It was the massive unemployment in Germany and the problems of Italy which led them to their power, and which then led to tyranny in Europe. And this meant that we had to find a way of dealing with this problem and establishing reasonable prosperity across our continent. Now, there were some who said, it is so grave a social evil that we must be prepared to take any measures to deal with it, even to forego some of our liberties. This was a position which some of us were never able to accept. And these two aspects of tyranny in Europe and dealing with social problems through centralized action were so closely connected that they dominated all our thinking and our action after the end of the Second World War. And that is why, quite simply, I am absolutely prepared not in a negative fashion, but constructively, to make a contribution of national sovereignty towards the well-being of this community, because I believe it's in the well-being of our own country and our people's interest. I take a much broader view of sovereignty than we have heard earlier this evening. Sovereignty is the power of a nation to look after the interests of its citizens. It always has been. The question is, how should it be done? Whether as in the 19th century, when we had got the naval power almost to enforce our view, but even Palmerston found it wasn't absolute, or in modern times, whether we do it in the form of the new institutions of the community. And so I wish to make this contribution of sovereignty. And when I hear the gross exaggeration of the effect on individual freedom, there is no impact, no deleterious impact on the individual freedom of the people of this country, because the community exists after the experience of the 30s to maintain individual liberty right across our own continent. That is its purpose. And when the... Yes, who?
Mr. Heath, is it not part of individual freedom to live under your own laws exclusively made by your own representatives in your own parliament? And is this not something worth preserving? And is it not something which the common market gravely threatens and will ultimately eliminate?
I'm afraid the honourable member has not followed the purport of my argument, which is that this community has new forms of institutions which are themselves democratic, and in which the British Parliament has its say, and in which no action can today be taken without the authority of British ministers. And it's up to British ministers to look after the interests of Britain. They are responsible to Parliament. The Secretary of State themselves are responsible to Parliament. If decisions which they accept in Brussels are not acceptable to Parliament, then they are overruled and they go. That they know perfectly well. But this is a reason why I am prepared gladly to make this contribution of sovereignty. But when I hear the two Secretaries of State saying that they must protect the sovereignty of Parliament, which is a much more narrow thing than the sovereignty of a nation, why? The reason we're having a referendum is precisely because neither of them are prepared to accept the decision of Parliament. That is... In 4 separate parliaments, by overwhelming majorities. 6. Us on a free vote, the Liberal Party on a free vote, the Labour Party on a whip, but with 69 of their members denying a 3-line whip. In 1971, Parliament moved that we should go into the community, and on the last occasion that we should stay in the community. That has been the will of Parliament, and it is the Secretaries of State who are not prepared to accept the will of Parliament. The 1970 election, which we've heard about, no political leader there asked that there should be a general election before we went into the community. Of course not. And at that time, when we took over the negotiating position of the then Labour government, because it was their policy to go into the community. They had tried once and failed in 67, 68. They decided to try again, and we took it over, and we went ahead with it. There was no reason why they should say there ought to be a general election. And similarly, nobody at that time said there should be a referendum. Of course not. It's alien to our whole parliamentary system and is in process.
If the Right Honourable Ex-President will forgive me, sir, was not his own government responsible for the introduction of this alien sort of device, this referendum, into a part of the United Kingdom, into Northern Ireland?
Because its parliament had been abolished. That's why we did it. And because we were under an obligation which we gave to the people of Northern Ireland that no change could take place in their position except with the authority of their own local parliament. not the United Kingdom Parliament, their own Parliament at Stormont. When Stormont was abolished, we gave them the right to deal with it by referendum because only Northern Ireland was concerned, and is therefore in a completely different situation from the situation today. And so, Mr. President, what I submit to you is this, that what really divides us tonight in this argument is not the question of details of prices or tariffs, however important they may be individually. It is not really the question of jobs. They are vital for the reasons I've been explaining. What really divides us is that those who are opposing this motion are, in fact, content to remain with the past development and institutions and organisation of the nation-state. And those on this side are those who want to move forward into a new organisation which is going to have greater success in meeting the needs of its peoples than the nation-state has done in the past. That is what clearly divides us. But then I hear it said, oh, but we ought to be thinking of the whole world. The implication of this is that until we reach that sublime moment when every country in the world is prepared to join an organisation of this kind, we should make no progress at all. This is an argument I cannot accept, because I believe that Europe, by its own creative, constructive imagination, is giving the lead to the world in the development of these organisations and institutions. And look at our own continent. We didn't drop the Iron Curtain. It was the East which divided Europe. If we now pull out of Europe, we are again dividing the West. And there can be no doubt at all that the security of the West cannot be maintained unless there is harmony and a reasonable economic basis for its security in the countries of the West. And therefore those who again say this has nothing whatever to do with security are, in my view, completely mistaken. Completely mistaken. And especially when we look at the other pillar of Western defence, which has been so rightly emphasised tonight, the United States. The United States has always looked to Europe to work together as an entity. It was Kennedy's policy, it has been American policy ever since, that the defence of the West should be based on an America and on a united Europe. And so, it is essential, in my view, that for our own security also, we should maintain the unity of Europe, and if we were to be pulled out, we should be disrupting that at a time which I would believe would be immensely damaging, not only to this country, but to the whole West. And of course it is an open community for those who wish to join it with similar views. It is not the fault of the community that some have failed to join. It is open to them. And the community has accepted its responsibilities. We've just heard criticism of the Lomé Agreement. The plain fact is that unless Britain had become a member of the community, that agreement covering 46 countries would never have been made. Never. Indeed, it would have been needed, and I will tell you why. Because it now contains 22 Commonwealth countries, and we in Britain are quite unable to meet their needs for development aid. Quite unable to. Heard about India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Well, after the failure of the first negotiations with de Gaulle's veto in '63, the plain fact is that the community immediately made special trade arrangements with those three countries of the subcontinent before any other arrangements were made with the associated states of countries formerly connected with one of the European powers. And so those countries benefited 12 years ago. And they have had the benefit ever since of special trading arrangements because we agreed them in our negotiations and the community carried them forward. This is not an inward-looking community. Its tariff has always been lower than ours. What hypocrisy to call it an inward-looking community. And what it does to help the developing world is far greater than any other part of the world is able to do. And then it said, a rich man's club. But how are we to help the developing world unless we have got the resources? Unless we have got the riches with which to help them in their development aid and in other ways. I've always accepted that to be poor but honest is an honourable thing. But it's also seen to me that to be honest and at the same time not so poor is equally honourable and on the whole rather more satisfactory. The community accepts its responsibilities to the rest of the world. I believe we should not treat this with snide remarks. We should treat it as a major achievement of a new world, a new European institution. And what of the future? We have a major part to play in this. We have our own constructive genius. They are looking for us to give a lead, and we have disappointed and failed them. They thought that they would be able to benefit from all our parliamentary experience. We could enable the community to become more democratic through its parliamentary control. But we have not given a lead in that, and to my regret, the Labour Party has never been prepared even to go to the European Parliament, nor the trade unions, to play their part in the Economic and Social Committee. But when this referendum is over and won, then I hope that the Labour members will attend and play their part, because Europe is incomplete without them. And I hope that the trade unions will play their part, because they, I believe, also have much to gain from their association with trade unions in Europe. And so in this future, we have a major part to play, and it is surely being conspicuous by its absence, any alternative offered. There was a time when the Free Trade Organization was put forward as the alternative. It has never been possible to achieve it in the past. We should not achieve it now. The tariffs would come up against us. And the reason is the simplest of reasons, that to have an industrial area without any agricultural trade is for the rest of the community a one-sided bargain, and they see no reason why they should make a one-sided bargain. Why, moreover, should they do it when, as we've torn up one treaty, we come along to them and say, well, now we'd like another? Do you expect them to say, yes, we have quite a nice variety of treaties? Pull one out, try it on. You didn't like the last. If you don't like this, throw it away, come back. It isn't the way that great nations work in deciding their affairs. But there is one thing which to me is all important in this, that were we to have that arrangement, then the decisions are taken in Brussels and we have no part in them. This, I do not believe, is acceptable to the British people. It is a real surrender of sovereignty. That is, with no countervailing benefits of any kind. It would not be acceptable to us, even though it may be acceptable to the 4 other nations who have got it at this moment. And so that is not an alternative. What has really been omitted tonight is to say what would in fact happen, and that is that if we were to pull out, we couldn't afford, the country is in no state to afford 18 months to 2 years renegotiation of some alternative agreement, not knowing that we were going to get to the end. No, what would happen would be that we would be driven into a siege economy. We would have to have import controls. We would have to have monetary controls. Indeed, there has been the demand for it from that side tonight. This is what, in fact, both Secretaries of State want to have. They want to have controls as complete as possible in order to defend us from the outside world. Now, this is the psychology of fear, the belief that we are unable on our own to compete and hold our own with our fellow partners in the community. That is not my belief. I do not believe it's the belief of the British people, and I do not believe it's the belief of this House here tonight. So, Mr. President, the future of Britain lies in the community. It is there that decisions are taken. And surely one of the key factors of life is one should be at the point where the decisions are taken. We have never in our history been able to avoid being involved with the mainland of Europe, however hard we tried, however much we wanted to. Now let us learn that lesson of history, and if we are going to be involved, then let us be there where and when the decisions are taken. The other aspect of sovereignty is that not only do we make an offering of sovereignty, we gain control over the sovereignty of 8 other countries who are our fellow members. Of course, Now, does anybody believe that in 1914, if we'd had control over the sovereignty of those countries, that we would have had conflict? Does anybody believe in 1939, if we'd had control over sovereignty of those countries, that we would have had conflict? It's very well for the honourable members opposite to sneer at this. This is absolutely basic to the future of 250 million people in Europe, their peace, their security and their prosperity. We are in the community, we have a great role to play in it, and there Britain's future lies. Then we can influence it, then we can change some of these matters which are now points of criticism with secretaries of state and others. Then we can ensure that we do more to help the developing world. But nothing can be done unless here at home we take the measures which are necessary for our own economic salvation. And there is one final thing which I want to say to this House tonight, because I believe it's important to most people in this country, that after we had gone through all the parliamentary procedures and I was duly authorised, I signed that treaty. It's not good enough for the Secretary of State for Trade to say that it has no consequence for the British people. When Parliament acts in a treaty, it acts for the whole British people. And I signed that treaty. I signed that treaty in the name of the whole British people. And what is at stake on Thursday is more than politics, and it is more than economics. It is not just my word, it is the authority of Parliament and the British people which is at stake. That is what is at stake. It is the honour of this country and the trustworthiness of our bond. And in the past, the world has looked to this House and drawn its conclusions from its debates, and the greatest occasion of all will be in the memory of some who are guests here tonight. This country will also look tonight to this House, and the rest of the world will look also, to see whether this House believes in honouring the good word of the British people, will then make sure that on Thursday you maintain our honour, maintain it, protect it and safeguard it, because it is beyond all value to the future of the British nation.
Well, an extraordinary demonstration in the Oxford Union for Mr. Heath after his speech on the Common Market debate. Mr. Heath recalling that 36 years ago he was president here himself and spoke at that dispatch box. Taking the applause rather impassively, it's little more like a Conservative Party conference than the Oxford Union. Conservative Party conference in the old days, that is. And the undergraduates here are letting themselves go. They were quite respectful during the speeches, but they've had a long evening with a lot of speakers, and they've enjoyed it. With me is Ludovic Kennedy, been watching the debate. Ludo, what do you think of it?
Well, listening and watching this tremendous welcome that Mr. Heath is getting, and very deservedly for a marvellous speech. And showing, I think, great stature, really sort of coming back to the old Heath we used to know. I can't help wondering whether the applause is for him personally or because of the cause which he stands for. Perhaps a mixture of both. I don't know, what do you think?
Yes, I believe that opinion in Oxford is a strongly pro-common market. As it happened, that doesn't necessarily mean very much.
The President is now there.
Yes,
the guests have
the
left.
President is just giving some instructions about the guests withdrawing, and they're going to withdraw. But we're going to come back to this debate in about half an hour's time for the, in about, yes, about 40 minutes' time, yes. Yes, towards midnight, that is. There'll be a programme about today's common market news coming to you from London in just a moment. There's the President. We'll just look at this scene in this very lively debate in the Oxford Union before we go. We'll see the speakers who've been speaking. Here's Mr. Heath, who was President here in 1939, being led through by Mr. Victor van Amerongen of Magdalen, who is this term's President. He's got 2 lady officers elected. There's Barbara Castle behind Mr. Heath, and Jeremy Thorpe, who made a speech in the Union manner. Mr. Heath gets a big hand as he goes out. Peter Shaw, who made a very powerful speech against a hostile audience and spoke with great eloquence, I thought. And most of the undergraduates are now going out to get a drink. But some of them will stay, and the lady librarian will be in the chair. She'll be calling them while the President's out, giving his distinguished guests a drink, and the vote will be taken at about midnight.
I thought, Robin, almost the best moment this evening was when Jeremy Thorpe interrupted Barbara Castle's speech to ask if the vote on Thursday went yes, whether she would resign, and she just said, if the vote goes yes, my country will need me to save it. And it got a great deal of applause.
Yes, I think the applause was much for the repartee as for the sentiments expressed.
I think so too.
It was a very fair, although the audience was very hostile to all these speakers, they were quite respectful, and they didn't attempt to, it was more respectful than I expected, actually. But anyway, we'll go now to London, where I think David Dibbleby has a roundup of today's common market news.
I thank the ex-President from Balliol for that speech. The hour for the closure of the debate having arrived, and the honourable mover having waived his right of reply, the House will proceed to a division. Honourable members wishing to vote in favour of the motion should occupy the benches on my right, and honourable members wishing to vote against the motion should occupy the benches on my left. Honourable members on the cross benches will not be counted. I call upon the tellers to withdraw.
Well, now, as you see, they're taking the vote. What has been happening is that in the earlier part of the evening, after the main speeches, people were recording their vote as they went out, and this vote now is just the vote of the 200 or 300 or the couple of hundred or so people left in the hall. It's been an interesting evening, notable for the tremendous reception given to Mr. Edward Heath, who... whether this was for pro-market sentiment or not, we don't know. We heard his comment on that in his interview with Ludovic Kennedy earlier. Of course, this vote here tonight, whatever it is not... the chap raising a point of order down there, it's not very important to the result. Of course, what this Oxford Union votes is not particularly important. It's not representative of all student opinion, and Oxford undergraduates have voted for some very silly things in the past. But this is a pretty good cross-section, probably, of undergraduates, and it's a much wider selection, a cross-section of society, undergraduates in Oxford today, than it was 30, 50 years ago, and certainly in the day when the Union was an aristocratic training ground for liberal or Tory politicians in the 19th century. But whether it's a representative vote or not of anybody, of students, it's certainly representatives of the people in this hall, and it's likely to be strongly pro-common market, and we'll hear the vote in a moment. Ludo, you were going to say something, I think.
Well, when you were saying that you thought that the cross-section of people here today was a great deal more representative of the country as a whole than it was in my day and in your day when you were president of the Oxford Union here, I was reminded of what Barbara Castle said in her speech. When she was up here at St Hugh's College, she wasn't even allowed into the Union. I think they're just going to announce the result now.
No, they're just counting it. They're going to give the figures to the young president. He's a scientist, the president, which is unusual for the president of the Union.
There appearing in favour of the motion 493 votes, and against the motion 92 votes. I declare the motion carried by 401 votes.
Well, that's the result. A majority of 401, 493 to 92. I thought there were rather more than that people in the hall to begin with. Perhaps a number of them didn't vote. But it's certainly an overwhelming majority. Whether or not pro-Europeans managed to queue up effectively and flood the hall with pro-market people, I don't know. But anyway, they won the vote, and this was the opinion here tonight. But the young president, Mr. Victor van Amerongen from Magdalen, is leading his team out of the House now, and that's the end from Oxford. Another debate on one of the great issues of our time, so many of which have taken place in this debating hall during the last 100 years or so. And this is Robin Day with Ludovic Kennedy at the Oxford Union saying good night to you.